Is classical music de-emphasizing rhythm? Is it a racial thing? Come and get your groove on with the demigod of electric violin, Tracy Silverman, on the next Music Un-Tuxed. Welcome, Tracy, to Music
Hey,
Un-Tuxed. I actually had Arnold Steinhardt on the first season, as you
I
know,
saw that. I saw that
and
episode.
I introduced him as the god of the violin. I'm not going to say you're the god of the electric violin because, of course, Jean-Luc Ponty is still with us. And,
Yes.
I'm going to just refer to you as Saint Tracy. Are you
I'll
all right with that?
accept that. That's fine.
Okay, all right.
A de demigod. We'll just say demigod.
Demigod. Yes, yes, demigod. Because Tracy Silverman, you were the first violinist of the Turtle Island String Quartet, and you started the Strum Groove Academy, your
Yes,
own, and you have a podcast for the Greater Groove,
correct.
and you've had Jean-Luc Ponty on that podcast.
Yes, I did.
Yes, you have a lineup of a who's who list of incredible musicians on that. So,
Thank you.
and you went to Julliard.
I did.
Juilliard, we got to put that little
Stamp of
school.
approval. Yes,
And I was reading a little more about you, and you soloed with the Chicago Symphony at the age of 13.
I did.
So I want to go back a little bit in time.
Yeah,
I heard about the albums that your brother gave you before you went to college. Enigmatic Ocean, one of my favorites. I am a fan. I have your Strum right
all
here,
right.
and you signed it. You are so personalized and what you want to do in your mission. This is a quote from your homepage. Strings should participate organically in our particular musical culture, or they will become old-fashioned and irrelevant.
Yep.
Strings must evolve, or they may perish.
I think there's a reality that could happen, obviously, years from now, but things are trending in that direction. I think if you just look at school band programs as opposed to string programs, and it's a fight to keep strings alive. And I think that rather than try to force interest in something that people may not organically be interested in, maybe we need to change the way we're dealing with strings so that people are organically interested in them and using them in a way that the way we use guitars and basses and saxophones and
Mm.
instruments in our popular musical culture.
I love that. And I see so many challenges for that too, like shifting
Yes,
an entire culture that has been created.
right.
And I saw you recently at a local high school here. And I love the way you interacted with the kids. And some of the kids come to my El Sistema program after, and they wanted that. Well, they seem to think, for some reason, one of the kids thought that the six string violin was $6 million. I don't know where that came from. I
I wish it was worth $1 million. That'd be
So
well.
yeah, and you were responsible for developing a lot of that, the six string violin.
Yes, I was one of the first people to build and play one back in the early 1980s. Me and Mark Wood. If you're familiar with that name, he
Yes,
makes the
of course.
Vipers and wood instruments. And he's gone on to have a business creating these instruments as well as performing on them. But back in, I think I reached out to him in 1981. I was in a progressive metal band in the Bronx in New York.
Wow.
And I had an acoustic violin with a pickup on it, playing it through a little Roland Cube amp. And the guitar player had two stacks of Marshalls. The keyboard player had a whole PA system for his mini keyboards, and the drummer with a zillion rototoms and all that kind of stuff. It was the 80s. And I couldn't compete. And they said, "Hey, I heard of this guy on Long Island who makes electric violins," and somehow I got his number. This was all pre-internet. Reached out to Mark Wood, and he said, "Oh, dude, come on out. We'll build one together." So he had made, I don't know, three or four of these already with various designs, and so I jumped in with him, and we built a bunch of six strings and kept building them and revising them and changing them every time I would change something. And so I got real familiar with the design process and the actual building because I actually made them myself, probably the first five or six of them in his woodworking shop. His dad was a woodworker and had a shop. So we were the first for about 10 years. We were the only two people on the planet who were playing six-string violins because we
Can
were
you
making them ourselves.
tell us about the six string?
So, well, here
Yeah, yeah,
the
great.
current one. Wait a second, let's caught on something here. The cable. So this is the most recent one that I have designed and had built by a guy named Joe Glazer here in Nashville, who's a great luthier. And that's, I don't know, maybe the 15th or 18th instrument that I've actually made over the years. And the design of them has changed dramatically since when I started doing them in the 80s. Using Barbera pickups. Rich Barbera makes, I think, the best pickup around. He custom makes these six-string pickups. The bridge itself is the pickup, and it has two piezo pickups under each string coming together. And so that's just something that I had to do out of necessity because there was no way to buy an instrument like that. So that's how that kind of
And it
started.
has, in addition to the C string, which gives it the five string, which is more like we have viola capability, it
Right.
has a lower F string.
Correct. A fifth down.
So
So
you
it's
really become a
all,
bassist.
yes, or really what I like to think of it is as a guitarist.
Okay.
Yeah, so it has the same strings as a violin, plus a viola C, and then a low F.
Ooh.
So it's all fifths. And that low F is like the first fret of a guitar. So it's essentially, it's a half step above the bottom note of a guitar. It has the full range of a guitar. In fact, it goes higher than a guitar because of the E string. But the reason I started building six strings and why I wanted to have six instead of four or five was solely to have that range of the guitar, to be able to do what guitars do. Because in my early days, I also have a strap design
I,
on
I,
here, chest support, and a
is it
whole.
heavy? Is it a heavy
It
instrument?
looks like it's solid, but it's actually hollow.
Okay.
So it's a little bit heavier than an acoustic violin, but
And I love
not.
how you're holding it, actually. I wish we could have that for, think there might be something now for violins, but I love how low you are. And
Well, I tell you what, I've had so many people, classical violinists and violists, who have said, "Wow, I wish I had something like this for my acoustic," because you can see it's completely self-supported.
yeah,
So I've actually designed something which is coming out this year, later this year, which is basically does this exact same thing for acoustic violins.
I want your mailing list for that one
It's
because that
almost ready. We're just about to send prototypes out to a few people to test it and get feedback and stuff. I know so many violin players who have neck issues, shoulder issues, back, whatever.
I saw the
Uh,
chiropractor 2 days ago.
yeah, exactly. And violists especially.
Yeah.
And also violinists who want to sing because this completely frees up your head. And what's interesting about freeing up your head is not only can you sing more easily when you're playing, but it just changes the way you can move. So violinists are so, locked into this thing and they move kind of like this,
I
but
love how
this
you
way you
mock violinists, by the way. I think that
because
it
I
took me a
am
little
one, right?
while to get through that one.
But it just frees up your whole body to move, which to me is one of the main things that I teach in my strumboing courses and private lessons and group lessons and all that kind of stuff. You cannot play groove-based music unless you can move.
Mm.
Move freely. Your body needs to be free to move with the rhythm. And that's just something that's never taught to classical string players in that way. In
Not
fact,
at all.
a lot of times they're taught not to move rhythmically. It's okay to move romantically or whatever, dramatically is what I should say, to sort of get into the music and you're doing this and you're kind of, playing, but like keeping time and bouncing with music, that's which brings up a whole other little topic,
There's so
not to
much.
get too.
I'm swirling in here right now. Yeah.
But the idea of why has rhythm become sort of on a back burner in classical music? This idea of showing rhythm,
Right.
dancing while you play. So much classical music came from dance music, from the
Exactly.
Baroque era. But I think And in fact, Mimi Rabson from Berklee School of Music, who was on my podcast a couple years ago, we were talking about this, and she said, I think it's a racial thing.
Mm,
This idea of classical music is very white European
yes.
music. And the idea of strong rhythm started to get associated with African music. So classical music started really de-emphasizing the downbeat, the sense of dance, the idea of showing rhythm and digging into the rhythm and having in pop music and funk music, it's all about the rhythm. It's
It is.
about dance and it's about feeling that. But classical music kind of went in the other direction. And I think that's just done a great disservice to string players and to classical
Yeah,
music, frankly. I think
definitely.
Bach should be played like,
A
with
dance.
like a
Yeah,
dance, at
definitely.
least at least certainly the dance movements,
Right.
um, comes from folk music.
Yeah.
And
I
yeah.
I know I'd always get scolded when I'd be playing sometimes solos with an orchestra because I'd stomp my foot.
Yeah.
I love stomping my foot, And then of course I do have that frame when I'm teaching my students. Well, we can't do that because in my background,
Yep.
I have that constant, it's a constant battle.
Yeah.
And I do want to backtrack then a little bit because yes, you were raised as well, I mean, you played 13 years old with the Chicago Symphony. So,
Yeah.
well, I guess you're like child prodigy. There you are, Tracy Silverman. And then you go to Julliard and so you must have had chops out of the wazoo. You were probably one of the stars at Julliard. And
Well, I thought I was going to be. Turns out there were some serious players. I was in the same class as Bobby McDuffie and Jenny
yeah,
Lynn
oh, got it.
and Nadia and just
So
like
yeah,
tons of
uh,
amazing players. So it was hard to stand out in that kind of
yeah.
those kind
Well,
of players.
a lot of big fish in that
Yes.
little pond.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
But the training that you received.
Yes.
So now, okay. So that, yeah, and you studied with Galaman.
I did. I studied with Ivan Galamian.
And and you do, and the way you play, I mean, you are clean. In addition to everything else, you've got like this technique to back you up.
Yeah.
So
Well,
you want to expound upon like so if we're going to evolve, because you're evolving, you're continuously evolving. I can feel it. I mean,
yeah.
today you've never been this old. So
That's
this
right.
moment right now, I am experiencing Tracy Silverman at his most mature essence right here. So, we're both evolving at this moment. And
Right.
and we're talking about you were with a group of kids, which I witnessed, all playing traditional acoustic instruments, and they're learning the traditional way. And then you're playing this badass violin playing that everyone wants to be, actually. um, but is there a place for that technique development? Is there a way to do it without going, twinkle twinkle through these books and then Mozart and Bach and all that stuff? You know, what's your take on that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I owe so much of what I'm able to do right now to my classical background, to the fact that I had really good teachers, not just Ivan Galamian. Also at Juilliard, I studied with Lewis Kaplan, who is amazing and
Oh,
is still alive. And I just saw him
incredible.
a few years ago. He's not, I mean, a few months ago. He's 92 years old and still kicking and running a Bach festival. Started a second Bach festival in New York. Amazing, amazing guy. Was the founder of the Aeolian Chamber Players back in the 60s, which was a contemporary, very important contemporary music ensemble. And also Deborah Wood, Deborah Schwartz, who was Deborah Wood when I worked with her in Chicago at the Chicago Musical College,
Mm.
who was an assistant to Morris Gomberg, was her teacher who I started studying with, and then he died when I was right in the middle of those Chicago Symphony concerts when I was 13,
Wow.
and she took over. So I've just had an amazing good fortune to study with some of the best teachers
You,
in the world.
you have lineage that probably goes back to like Vivaldi and Tartini and all of them. I mean, if you look at it, those
Yeah.
teachers that you
Well,
mentioned,
Gomberg studied with Leopold Auer,
yeah.
so so it was really came from all of that, and so very fortunate. It's just so privileged that my parents were able to drive 2 hours every Saturday to take me to Chicago
Mm,
for lessons. That they had the values and the money and the time to do that. I count my blessings every day. I was very lucky to have had that opportunity. And so I want to make the point that my classical background is the foundation that all of this is standing on. And for me, learning how to play popular music was a second language, right?
okay.
And an important second language, but it's interesting that for string players, learning how to play in our popular musical idiom, the music that surrounds us all in the 21st century, what's on TV, what's in movies, what's on streaming and radio, if you still have a radio, and all that kind of stuff, is everybody's first language. That's our
Mm,
lingua franca. That's the language that we speak musically. Jazz, rock, hip hop, all of that stuff. That's what our culture has produced. And yet for string players, that's a second language to have to learn.
mhm.
String players have to learn our contemporary musical culture, the way to speak, the lingua franca, as a second language,
Hmm.
which is just not the case for horn players, for piano players, for guitar players. So that's an added burden that we have, and this is what I'm trying to the gap that I'm trying to bridge and
Yeah.
make it easy for string players to rejoin our culture because or the popular musical culture because strings were at one time hundreds of years ago or even 100 years ago maybe very much in the thick of the popular musical culture, whether that was baroque dances which came from folk fiddling,
Hmm.
jigs and berets and all that kind of stuff. The violin was a big part of that,
You,
as strings were.
you
And
could carry it. It was easy to just
yeah,
pick up and
right. And
take it on the
the
road.
link from those jigs to Celtic music to bluegrass, it's very a very continuous line of folk fiddling, and even in the more high cultural kind of like Strauss waltzes and this kind of stuff, the strings were still a very dominant part in orchestras and in the symphonic world. The string, the violin is the concert master and the lead instrument, and a big important part of that. But in the 20th century, in the middle 20th century, things really changed, or really in the early 20th century, the jazz era. Other instruments became the dominant voices. Guitar became the sound of rock. Saxophone became the sound of jazz. And before that, maybe the trumpet, Louis Armstrong, and things like that. And strings didn't follow with everybody else. They kind of went, no, we're going to stay in the West, in the European classical art music tradition, and sort of refuse to become a part of our musical culture. And that schism really stayed. When I went to Juilliard, we didn't learn this stuff. We learned this stuff, the old traditional European music. So not that there, and I always want to put a disclaimer. That's my first love is all of that
Mm.
classical repertoire. But, I think string players need a way to rejoin our culture so that they can participate organically as a
Yeah.
part of the rhythm section, as a part of the band. They need to remember how to play rhythm on our
Mhm.
instruments. And so that's explains the next step.
I have to say when I see you playing some of your music and hearing those Jean-Luc Ponty tunes that you play on that sixth string, I feel like you love it pretty much. And I see you
Oh
at
yeah.
the ASTA conference playing almost all day at your booth. It's like
Yeah.
I can feel the love that you have for
Thanks.
what you're
Yeah.
doing.
No, I do love it. And, I mean, I was raised with pop music.
Hmm.
I was a child of the '70s, and I was like born in 1960. But so I listened to the Beatles and Led Zepp, and all the guitar heroes. And basically what happened was all my friends in high school had guitar heroes, right? Whether it was Clapton or Hendrix or Dwayne Allman, Santana, whatever, sort of almost like a favorite sports heroes, it
Hmm.
was very common for high school kids to, play air guitar and know the solos from Led Zepp tunes and stuff like that, and Stairway to Heaven solo. And
So as you were learning your violin and your classical music alongside, you were listening to all the pop tunes and
exactly.
appreciating that, and then you wanted to. And did you do with the violin all the pop tunes as well? Back
Well,
when you
so
in
the
high
thing
school?
was, I remember as a kid, people, I was a violin player. People said, "Well, play me a song." And I was like, "Well, I can't really play anything without a piano accompanist. And I don't think you'll really know this Sibelius violin concerto." And they're like, "Well, can you play Stairway to Heaven?" And I'm like, no. And that actually was kind of scarring in a
Yeah.
weird way. And I felt this schism, and my friends, thought it was cool that I played the violin, but they didn't know what a Sibelius was, and they didn't
Right.
care really about music from 300 years ago. They were into Led Zepp. And so, long story short, I just wanted to play music they would think was cool
Yeah.
and they would like and they would get. And I intuitively knew that meant that I needed to speak not in a voice that was dominant hundreds of years ago, but in our current sound of our pop culture, which was guitar.
Hmm.
So I figured out that if you take an electric violin, if you put a pickup on it and put it through an amp and crank it up, it sounds a lot like a guitar.
Hmm.
So that essentially sounds like a
Yeah.
guitar to anybody who knows what an electric guitar sounds like.
What student wouldn't want, if they're playing the violin, who wouldn't want to sound like that? Come on. I,
Well, you'd be surprised. Not everybody loves rock and roll, but back when I was a kid, pretty much at least all my friends did. So that was my solution, and of course, it took me many years to adapt my technique
Mhm.
and retool it essentially to do the vibrato that sounds like that, to figure out how to the gear, the instruments, building the instruments, trying amps, trying different pedals, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I have a student I want to ask you about because, and this is like maybe your advice to teachers that have students that want to like,
Yes.
okay, so he's playing, he just started taking private lessons. It's amazing. He's so persistent. He's doing things just, instinctually. So he's like this, but we're trying to get him all down. But he's
Yeah.
doing this piece, he's doing Crazy Train
Yeah.
and all these ridiculous solos. And then his mom says, now he's going to be using an electric violin. Do you have one that he could borrow? And I said, well, I have this carbon, but I have a couple, but not really, nothing like what you have. But just so I do have something he can borrow. And then she said, well, now he's wondering about using pedals, and well, he need to get a cut. And so my advice was just well, right now he really needs to kind of clean up the piece because he's kind of hiding behind a lot of the stuff like there's opportunities to hide,
Yes. Yes, for
and
sure.
so why not try to make it as clean as possible and then go into that route. So
Yeah.
but I would love to hear, you seem to be agreeing, but I'm not quite sure, as a
Yeah.
primarily
Well,
acoustic
it's a
player.
it's a very good question, interesting point. I think it's really a balancing act as a teacher between if you have a student who's into non-classical music, right, whatever that is.
This kid, he dresses like a rock star. I mean, he's just a walking rock star.
Right. So if that's where his interest is, my MO as a teacher is I always let the student lead me towards what they want to do.
Okay.
And what we do is we work on tunes they know, they like, they want to do. Like I want to learn this tune because a couple reasons. When they have a tune like that they can play, they'll play it for their friends,
Mhm.
and that reaction and that sense of community that builds between the violin player and their friends is something that I yearned for and is incredibly powerful and fights the attrition that happens in string playing where kids quit to
Right.
either go into sports or to play guitar. And if you want to keep kids playing strings, and this is why I say if we don't adapt, strings may perish.
Yeah.
If we can keep them playing strings and getting that positive feedback from the friends that, oh my God, that's so cool, that's what keeps kids playing. So the first thing we do is work on the tunes they like.
Yeah.
And then while we're doing that, even without them realizing it, we can say, like, let's work on the pitch. It's a little out. How do we fix that? Well, let's get some bow control. This is going to sound better. You're going to have a better attack on your picking attack on the guitar. If you do this with loosen up your wrist. And so then they have a reason to do it right. If the goal at the end, the carrot, is that you can play a gavotte that they have no interest in playing,
Mm.
they're not going to be motivated to fix their wrist or
Got
to,
it.
so let's
Yep.
give them a reason and then, they'll do the work because they want to get there. They want it to sound better.
Hmm.
So,
So, wow, where does Shevchik and Shradic come into all that?
you know,
Is that
um,
like
I,
supplemental? Could you still employ that or no?
I'm sure, I know Mark Wood, for instance, swears by Shradiak,
Oh,
but
really?
yeah.
Okay,
Um,
good. That's good.
uh,
You know what? I'm going to use that on my students because I think Mark Wood, I think that's his version that I think it's his, a lot of these pieces that these kids play in school, I think they're his compositions. So the kids should,
yes. Yeah. And I'm really afraid of doing stuff that's just exercises for the sake of exercises. I think
got
there's
it.
so much music that you can play like in the middle of a Jean-Luc Ponty solo. Here's a cool lick. Let's do this. And they're going to learn the same stuff as they'll learn in a Shradiak
I'm glad you're
section.
saying that. Yeah, because it's so much more rewarding to do it that way. Take a
I
little
think
snippet
so.
out of a piece they're doing.
I mean, to me, having a student having their enthusiasm is the most valuable thing. Developing their enthusiasm for the instrument,
Mm,
their love, their appreciation for good playing, their desire to want to get better. That's the key. If they don't really care about it, it's hard. They're not going to put in the work. They have to.
hmm
It has to be something you really want to do.
hmm
Nobody in this
Yeah.
day and age of instant gratification, the idea of practicing at all for is such a long-term goal. It's great, but holy cow, it's really hard to get people to commit
hmm
with both feet, if it's not something they really, really want, you know.
Wow. Yeah, they
So,
really have to
so,
want it.
so my job is to make them want it,
Right.
to just build their enthusiasm, to light a fire under that, and then help them get there.
hmm
But if they know where they want to, if you can kind of clarify where they want to go,
hmm
and then just kind of give them some helpful
Yeah.
pushes.
So you mentioned not to get too nitpicky on technique, but I'm kind of
Yeah,
curious because
yeah.
I did see that one of your ads, I think, I don't know if they're ads or whatever, it's on Facebook, and it was like a mocking of the classical vibrato. Oh. And and then all of a sudden you come in with your strum bowing and it's really cool. And so you did mention vibrato, and you do use vibrato,
Yeah.
but there a different technique?
Yes,
Okay.
definitely a different technique. The way I talk about vibrato as like your accent,
Yeah.
and it defines where you're from. And if you're from classical music, you have a classical accent. And there's nothing wrong with being from anywhere. You could be from New York and have a New York accent. You can be
Right.
from London and have a British accent. Nothing wrong with your accent. But if you are an actor and you have a heavy Brooklyn accent and you have to play a British part, you got to learn how to change your accent. So a classical accent has a vibrato that sounds like, it's a
Okay.
fast, narrow, beautiful, warm sounding vibrato. In jazz, vibrato kind of does the opposite thing. It cools the music in a way. It releases the tension rather than bringing this sort of sense of passion, right? And in jazz, you might have a
Mm.
and there's no vibrato for a while, and then it releases like pop singers do. And or if you want to sound like a saxophone, that vibrato is actually very different from, and I
Yeah.
teach it differently, you know, instead of, I teach what I call the car alarm exercise to develop a different vibrato. So instead of pressing our finger all the way down and rolling, what we're going to do is press not so hard and slide it like a glissando.
Mm.
If I exaggerate it, it sounds like this. And we narrow it, and it becomes this slidey kind of shake. Which is different from, right? It just sounds different.
Definitely.
It's slower, wider. So those, it's definitely a different vibrato with a different accent that sounds more contemporary and less classical.
What about all these students out there studying with teachers that are kind of doing the traditional method and just advice to students? Because now you came up a certain way, and you, I don't know, maybe you broke through a wall to get to where you're at.
Yeah.
And do they have to break through a wall? Do they have to persevere in the way that you did? What
Well,
what's your advice to students today?
Well, you know, it's a very different world than it was in the 80s, you know, when I graduated from Juilliard in 1980. There were no models except for Jean-Luc, you know, but he was really playing jazz and I wanted to play rock.
Right.
So it was a little different, you know, different thing. But except for him, there were no models really for who, you know, playing electric violin. So
Mhm.
I had to do a lot of inventing and it took a long time. And I had rock bands and I was the you know, main rhythm instrument. We had no guitar in my band for many years just because I wanted the violin to have to do what a guitar does. So
Mhm.
I had to teach myself how to play rhythm while I was singing, and that's how I started with the strap and all that kind of stuff. And it was a very long development process over, you know, which is how I sort of developed this whole strum bowing idea. It came from the fact that I was doing this for 10 years with my rock bands. And after a while, people were like, how are you doing that? I was like, oh, I'm just, you know, keeping time. And I realized that, oh, actually, this is really different from what I was doing at Juilliard. You know, this has sort of really evolved into a whole other thing. And I've been copying guitars for so long, for so many years, and trying to get their feel, their rhythm, all of that kind of stuff. Um, Point is that now students have the advantage of my work and on all the strombone courses that they can learn from Mark Wood's stuff,
Mhm.
Christian House's stuff.
Mhm.
You know, there's just all kinds of Casey Dreesen. There's all kinds of amazing players, and of course, because of the internet, kids have access to all that stuff. So it's a whole lot easier, a whole lot more possible. They don't need to break through barriers of, you know, having to invent this from thin air. Uh, one of the big barriers that I did have that I think a lot of kids will still have to deal with is the barrier of expectations of what they're supposed to do with their violin playing now that they spent 10 or 15 years learning classical music.
Mhm.
Does that mean that they need to go into classical music? Can they shift gears to jazz, to rock? Um,
What
there
do
was
you
a lot
think?
of Well, it depends on their family, frankly, and their teachers.
Right.
I had a lot of pressure from my parents to stay in classical music. Why are
Yeah.
you wasting your talent? You know, you went to Julliard. Why are you playing at CBGB's at 2 in the morning for three
Mhm.
people? It was hard to explain to them,
Yes.
for
Yeah.
many years. It didn't make any sense. I wasn't making any money. I wasn't getting famous. I was not achieving any goals. But I was learning a lot and developing a lot as a player. But so if kids have parents who are not flexible about that, or teachers who are not flexible, they do have to break through that barrier themselves and go, you know what? I want to do something else, and I'm going to
Mhm.
learn from. If you don't want to teach it to me, I'm going to learn it over here.
Yeah.
So, but again, as I said before, I'm a huge adherent of the idea of students playing the music they want to play, that they love. That's where they're going to make the most progress, develop their own voice, find their love for it, stick with it longer, and all of that. So, um, I think if you have to tell your parents or your teachers that that's what you want to do, then maybe that's what you need to do. And so I try to give them a little support and encouragement. They need a support system, and I try
Mhm.
to provide that. Yeah. And my whole strumboing thing, by the way, was really geared towards classical players. It
Mhm.
was geared towards how do we teach classical players with all the training
Yeah.
and the background that we have and the conception of what music is, how violin playing should be done, how it should be taught, and all that kind of stuff. How do we honor that and yet move ahead
Mm.
to learn a second language? Doesn't mean I'm never gonna forget how to speak English, even if I lived in, a Spanish speaking country for 20 years. I wouldn't
Right.
forget my mother tongue. Um, it's a second language, and for most string players, that's what our popular culture is.
Mhm.
And I think, it's sort of like you're living in a Spanish speaking country. You're living in a country where your first language is not the country's first language. So you better learn how to speak if
Yeah.
you want to get
So
along. I
I'm
mean,
just
but
wondering, is this something, are you trying to make the violin assimilate to pop culture, or are you
yeah,
trying to do something
create something
beyond?
new. Right, right, right.
That's
Good,
yeah.
very good. Yeah, it's a very good and nuanced question. Um, I because I've struggled with this, and my conclusion has been that if we're trying to play jazz or rock or hip hop on a violin on strings, our first job is to imitate the instruments that are in that genre,
Hmm.
right? If you're trying to play rock, sound like a guitar because that's what rock sounds like. Then do things maybe beyond what guitar players do, bring some of the extra abilities that strings have with a bow, things we can do with the bow, so we can do sound a lot like a guitar and do a lot of the things, not everything that a guitar can do,
Hmm.
but we can do other things that guitars can't do. So that's the kind of the key. Like, let's adopt the language and then say what we can say in it. And same thing for jazz. Listen to sax players, listen to horn players, because I and there are differences of opinion. This is purely my opinion, and it's very subjective. Um, but I think if you sound like a classical vibrato and you're playing jazz, I don't think that's appropriate. Now, I know some people disagree. They think, now, well, you sound like a jazz violinist and not a jazz sax player. I
Mm.
think even if you have a different vibrato and a sax vibrato and you're playing sax licks, if you're doing it on a violin, you're still going to sound like a violin. You
Right.
know, it's like a student once said, I love Miles Davis so much. I feel like I'm imitating him all the time. I just sound just like Miles. And I don't want to just sound like Miles. I said, don't worry. You could try to imitate Miles your entire life. You are not going to sound like Miles Davis, especially not on a violin. But even on a trumpet, you probably wouldn't sound like
Yeah,
Miles Davis.
right.
Don't worry about it. Use that as a guide, use it as a model,
Mm.
imitate as much as you can, as precisely and exactly as you can. Try to imitate the pitch, the timing, the vibrato, the attack, every detail of his playing that you can.
Hmm.
I encourage you to copy as best you can.
Yeah.
You're still not going to sound like Miles.
Right.
Don't worry about it.
Well, and I guess that is we are imitators, and we've always been in a way. I mean, we're like the conduit of the
Well,
music anyway.
the problem that we're facing right now is that, like I said, there was sort of this schism in the 20th century where popular culture went this way and strings stayed in a
Yeah.
older tradition. Because of that, now if we want to play in popular culture, we've got to speak their language,
Hmm.
because strings are no longer an organic part of that.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that 20 years from now, strings can't be contributing once we adopt that accent and we can play and speak in that language. We can start doing things that guitars can't do that are uniquely string. We can play pop music that has a guitars can't really sound like that, and yet I'm speaking in their language. I'm speaking in a popular, it's not classical music, but we can do something that is uniquely string. And to do that, we first need to speak their language and then do it on strings. So, and that's my hope, is that strings will find their place in popular culture, but in an organic way, and not just adding the symphonic string, classical string sound to a pop song, because
Right.
that's a very different thing. That's just adding strings because they're bringing in this Western symphonic tradition, because we associate strings with that. And in fact, it really does the opposite of what I'm trying to do. It reinforces that strings are from something else. They're outside of, like you'll hear strings on a rap tune. The strings are brought into to sort of be a foil,
Right. Yes.
almost to show how different rap is from symphonic music,
Yeah.
and I'm trying to do the opposite.
Yeah, I think that's why sometimes people give me a call about things like that, because, oh, we want that sound.
Right.
But yeah, I think this is wonderful. This is really, can you play? You're giving us a little tidbits. Do you want to could you play just a little something a little bit longer for us? Or,
I'm just going to show you a little part of a tune. I won't bore people with the whole thing, but just to kind of demonstrate what I mentioned the strum bowing idea a few times.
Yeah.
And so just to clarify what that is, it's my term for basically ripping off guitar players, how they play rhythm, and learning from guitar players who will play, by keeping a kind of a motor. I refer to it as a motor going in their arm. I just give you, before I play this, just a quick demonstration of what that means. If let's say I wanted to ask string players to play this rhythm, da 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 da, ba 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 da da. Right? If you ask a string player to play that, they'll play it like this. Right? But if you ask a guitar player to play it, they're going to play it like this. Which immediately grooves better. Why? And what's different? What's different is that they're doing this with their hand. In fact, if I muted it, it would sound like, it would look the same. Or I can go. If you had the sound muted, you wouldn't know what was that, because this looks the same. And that's how I discovered this, was watching TV and muting it, seeing a guitar player, unmuting it, and it was playing a different song, his hand was still moving. I was like, what? Oh, that's what's going on. So for string players, if we do that with a bow, we're going to get this. Right? And we can accent. maybe, but it doesn't sound like the guitar. It's not the same thing. So we need to learn how to ghost. We need to go where we're able to keep that motor moving, keep that strum happening, but not play. So that's basically what strum bowing is in a nutshell. It's keeping a strum going to keep a rhythm rather than as it comes bowing, which never grooves and is often not even accurate. Right? So this keeps us locked to a grid. So that's what that is. So this is a tune that uses that, and I'll show you how this becomes a little more applicable and applies to real life. Had to go over there and hit my loop button. So I just recorded that, and then gotta get to my wah-wah pedal. So that just gives you kind of a
Yeah, that was amazing. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Whew. Wow, now that got my vibrations going. Rhythm all over the place.
Yeah, yeah. And, basically participating in our popular musical culture on a string.
Exactly. Wow. And it's all very accessible. You have it, your Strum Bowing Academy.
Yeah. And, it's funny, people, when I first decided to do that, I was like, I want to teach people how to groove. And people's like, you can't teach. Either you're born with it or you're not. And I'm like, I work with a lot of students, and you can actually develop this in students. There's a step-by-step process. And one of the keys is just do what guitar players do. Keep a steady rhythm, and you'll be amazed at how that completely changes the picture. It's so simple.
Mm.
It's such a simple solution, but it's just not taught. String players are never taught how to not play a note, how to ghost.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So,
It's kind of against the rule for us.
right. And I'm glad you used that word, because I often talk about different rules for different schools. And one of the biggest problems for classical players is the mindset of what we've been taught. And we are so trained to follow rules, to read what's on the page, do not, add anything, don't leave anything out, play it exactly what's on the page. And there are all these rules that we have adopted, whether we realize it or not. And they're completely the opposite of what you need to play in a lot of the popular musical culture, whether it's jazz, rock, hip hop. A big part of that is improvisation on some form or another. Even if you're not taking solos, if you're in the rhythm section and you're playing chords, you're like, play 4 bars of a D7 chord and make it funky. What string player can take that information and make good sense out of it? If you're a classical string player, you're like, well, I don't know what a D7 chord is, because we're never taught, that in our violin lessons. We maybe, if we take theory, I don't know how to make it funky. And, what do I do? So anyway, you can teach all this stuff step by step. You can teach first this, then do this, then do that. Now add. Now you can learn how to chop.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, and for people who may not be familiar with that, a chop sounds like this. It's just this. Turn that delay off. It's this chop sound, which is good for like a drum backbeat. But if you want to play a groove with it, you're going to have to do something I call a compound chop, which is subdividing that chop, basically, just the way we subdivide here with our bow. We can do that here, and then we can add horizontal notes into this vertical stroke. And harmony. And all of that stuff can be taught step by step. First you learn how to do this, then you add this.
And you lay it out. You lay it out.
I've got etude books that, show people
Yeah.
how to do it.
Yeah, etude books. Oh, bad word, but that's okay. This is Strumbowing etude books. It's fun.
You know what? Classical players love a good etude book. It's just show me what to work on. I will work on it.
Right, that's
I
true.
love that work ethic that classical players have, because holy cow, that you don't see that all the time in the rock and jazz world. At least not in the rock world. Jazz more so, yeah.
Oh, okay, so we're good for something, right? Yeah. Well, thank you. I cannot thank you enough. I've been so excited for this interview with you,
Yeah, man.
Tracy.
Me too, man.
Yeah.
It was so great to see you again when I was in Lancaster. We had a great time hanging out, having a beer,
Yeah.
and
That was so much
to
fun.
find out about all the amazing work that you are doing,
Mhm.
and the work that you've done, all your history, which is very rich and incredibly diverse. Even though you don't talk about it, and you talk about yourself as a strictly classical player, but you're doing so much other stuff, and the also the El Sistema program that you're doing. It's so important.
We will definitely stay in touch and groove on, right?
Yeah, man, groove on.